And everyone's making standards, but people don't realize why these standards are so bad. Most standards are made up to begin with. No one even knows if it's right. No one even knows if it'll bring performance half the time. And then when it's biased and it requires decision-making, you have a non-expert making them usually. To show you how bad standards can be at times, is this an example? One of the largest standard-setting organizations within the construction materials industry. I'm going to show you how we found out that they set their standards. Dr. Dean went to their conferences, and he was amazed by how it was set. So this is an exterior silicone waterproofing material. What they'll do is they'll have a list of physical properties of the material. They'll bring in all the manufacturers, and they'll develop a test to test each physical characteristic. For instance, the tensile strength, they'll get a sample, and they'll all pull it apart, and wherever it breaks, that's the measurement. And so they'll make the requirements. All of them will go back and test a sample of their material and bring back their results. Let's take one, the tensile strength. So when all the vendors come in, let's imagine now, they bring back their things, and these are the results. Without knowing anything, you can quickly see some issues. One is that some of these ranges are way too large. Another is no one ever asked the other person what kind of sample they used. Was it a big sample, a little sample? It matters a lot, but nobody checks. And so let's look at some of these. And let's say we had to pick, you're an owner, you have to pick what is the right measurement. Is it 400? Is it 500? Nobody knows. But let's just pick one. Let's be on the safe side. Realistically, if you're a person, you're like, oh, 450, that seems like a good average. You pick 450. Immediately, these vendors now do not qualify. So if you're one of those vendors, what will you do now? Yeah, so ideally I got to make my product better. So they'd go back and fix it and bring it. No. If you're realistically speaking a vendor, one, you'd ask the question, how do you know my material isn't as good as the others? How do you know that that is the correct standard? And if they were taking them to court, the court trial would be very quick. Because they'd ask them, how do you know if 450 is correct? And the answer, we don't. We just picked a number. What will happen is they'll go to each requirement, and what will they do? The only thing they can. They'll pick the minimum in every physical property, and that becomes a standard. Now, people don't realize this is how mostly every standard is set, mostly in construction. You'll see all these specs and realize that all these standards are what? Practically meaningless. And nobody knows what the right one is. This is a spec on an actual product, a single-ply roofing material. It was one of the best by the numbers, by the metrics. It's one of the best. It was ridiculous. It's saying that the ultimate elongation, you can increase this thing 300%, and it will come back to its original shape, and it'll still be okay. This was the best-selling material in like the 1990s. It was sold to everybody, and they sold it very cheap. That's why it was the best-selling. But in about 1990s, in the city of Grand Rapids, they had an issue. They had one very cold night. And in that cold night, it lost all its plasticizers. And in one night, 100 of these roofs exploded. Now, the funny thing about this is a year later, this was still the #1 selling roof in the industry because it met the specs. Now, the reason the low bid traditional price-based approach is so bad and why the performance is always low is because clients and owners always think in terms of minimums. Even if they don't, the second you set a standard or put the requirement in, it immediately becomes a minimum to the owner. They want, this is the minimum amount of performance that I want on my project. But the vendors who realize that this is all a price-based approach turn this minimum into a maximum, and they drive performance the other way. And the vendors now begin to play a game with the owner. They see how close they can get to that minimum requirement and cut their costs as cheap as they can to still get the job. The owners spend all their time making the requirement and then trying to measure the requirement and then telling them what the requirement is and inflicting punishment if it's not met. And all the contractors or vendors are trying to do is meet it with as minimal resources as possible so they can still compete based on price. And performance will always go down. It's an adversarial approach where everybody is now only thinking of who? Themselves.